Okay, so we are now officially recording. Welcome, welcome. Well, I am so excited to get to introduce. Oh, no, 1 second. Sorry, I didn't realize I had to admit folks. Okay, I am so excited to get to introduce to you Mr. Gregory Handleton, and he comes with, gosh, lots of years of experience in the field, been licensed since 1999, and also has earned the TRCC certification, as well as many other treatment modalities within his experience working with clients. And so we are just thrilled. I personally also am so excited to get to learn more about EFT, and then also to implement some how-tos from this session. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Greg, so that you can have the most amount of time in our breakout, since we are a little bit shy on time. So thanks, everyone. Welcome. If you have questions as the presentation is occurring, please just throw those in the chat box, and I will get to them just as soon as we can. All right. Thanks, everyone. Welcome, welcome.
All right. Can everyone hear me? All right. And so let me click out of this here. I'm kind of assuming that everyone can hear me. I'm unmuted. And I checked my mic.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I don't know about you guys, but after listening to Rama, I don't know if I needed a break so much as I needed to run around the building 6 times. Just an amazing testimony that she gave. I'm sure you all are also just filled up with all the good things that she shared. So again, kudos to her. Thank you to her. So we're going to jump right in. I'm going to switch over to the PowerPoint. Everyone should have a manual that was sent as a handout, the EFT training manual. You can follow along with that if you've been able to print it up, or if you have it on your screen or on a different screen. So unfortunately, the slides on the manual don't have page numbers. I'm going to try not to jump around in the manual. I'm just going to kind of work our way through, hopefully get through as much of it as possible. There's 150 something slides, so we'll do our best with that. And just understand, this is really an introduction. You're not going to become an expert today, but you'll find that the manual is going to take you pretty far. This particular manual that I put together, it'll take you pretty far into some practice with EFT. But of course, you've got quite a few other handouts that I made available. You'll notice that some of them are quote unquote old. They're 2011 or 2007 or somewhere in there. I'm sharing these because they're still viable and important. And so I don't want you to discount them because of the year on them. EFT is, you'll quickly get overwhelmed with EFT reading just through books and through online websites, and certainly through YouTube videos and all that's out there now. So we're just going to dive right into the manual, and we'll, like I said, take questions as possible. So feel free to interrupt me if there's a really important question. So the second slide is a little bit of a disclaimer. This comes from EFT Universe. I'm not going to spend time here, but there's just some important thoughts. EFT is still considered somewhat experimental, although now there's much more validating research in terms of evidence-based practice. So we're going to skip through that. The third slide is also a little bit more information about the disclaimer.
Hey, Greg, do you want to share your screen?
Oh, okay. I hit the button. Let me go back to that.
Okay. There should be a share screen button at the bottom.
Okay, I'm going to hit it right now.
Okay, perfect. And also, just while you're doing that, I have attached both a zip file as well as a PDF in the chat box for you to access, which includes the handouts for this presentation. Perfect. We can see your screen.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. All right. So So a little bit about myself. We don't have to spend much time here, but definitely I was in EMDR, so familiar with that. I kind of stopped using EMDR on an outpatient basis because I felt like EMDR was activating people's trauma and then I would send them home. That wasn't such a great feeling. A little bit later is when I discovered EFT, so kind of shifted my reading and my study over to that. So let's move to why EFT. We all understand sometimes with talk therapy how long of a process it can be, and then with the length of that process, there's a higher risk of people dropping out. EFT tends to work quite quickly. Doesn't mean that you don't use your normal counseling process. Obviously, everything that you've learned as a trained clinician will apply, especially when it comes to informed consent and just setting the stage and getting people acclimated and building rapport and all those good things. EFT is really going to be a great tool that you can insert into the therapeutic process with consent, of course. Sometimes little by little, sometimes you'll have a client who's ready to dive right in because you're recommending a fantastic tool like EFT. So it really depends on the person. We all have encountered situations where people are talking about and talking through a trauma and not feeling relief. And we all understand what that can feel like as a clinician, to feel like we're almost just re-traumatizing them at times through talking about it again and again and again, going back through these memories. Yes, we're now much more well-versed in mindfulness and DBT type skills, but it's still, it can still be a problem for clients to feel like they're going back through kind of rehashing their trauma and not walking out of the room feeling better. One of the great things about EFT, and I noted this with EMDR, doesn't seem to activate the trauma so much as it processes it and neutralizes the negative emotional charge associated with specific aspects of the trauma. So it's very gentle. Another great thing about it is you do not have to tell, or the client does not have to tell or speak out sort of the gory details, as we say. They can keep the specifics private. Now, obviously, they have to be able to share with you some information about where they're at in the processing. So they could maybe use a code word or a keyword without divulging all of the details per se. So that's a great thing about EFT. Another great thing is, clients can't use EMDR on their own. They always have to be clinician led, but they can use EFT on their own with some caveats there, of course, but it is a tremendously useful self-help tool that people can use. Another great thing about EFT, that core issues are actually targeted first in general, which means that people experience actual relief sooner rather than later. So we're going to get into that. And it can help with the emotional stress that borderline clients experience because they're always tuned into their pain. So even some of the more difficult folks that we, kind of like what Rama was talking about, she was the difficult one, and people, started kind of subtly passing blame onto the client. Well, those are the folks who can also benefit from EFT because it's gentle and effective. So the next slide, why EFT training? I'm going to kind of skip over this, but the great thing with even this manual is you're going to get a lot of how-tos and not just background. There is some background we're going to go through right now, but you're going to get a lot of the nuts and bolts of EFT. The next slide, vision statement. This is something that I just put here to reduce both the current prevalence and therefore the multi-generational perpetuation of trauma-induced and trauma-related human suffering in our homes and communities. So EFT is a great tool to start some healing ripple effects, as it were, along with all the other trauma work that you're doing. The roots of EFT. Let's spend a little bit of time here. You'll just see from this slide, this goes back even into the 1920s. Wilhelm Reich coined the term muscular armor based on his observation that emotional trauma can result in rigidity in certain parts of the body. We have Joseph Wolpe treating World War II veterans. He discovered that diaphragmatic breathing in the course of recalling a trauma memory from war was helpful. And I guess we could stop there, right? Say, well, he figured it out in 1958. Let's just do that, right? Well, fortunately, there's more to it now that we can, with EFT and other similar therapies that are out there. Then we have George Goodhart. So looking at acupuncture in terms of, what was brought over into the Western world. So he discovered that he could treat physical conditions with tapping. So this goes back into the 60s on these acupuncture points. And so he coined the term applied kinesiology. Find my cursor here. Next slide, again, roots of EFT. There's certain elements within EFT that when all joined together in EFT, which help to make it effective. So we have some holistic psychology components, we have conditioning, counter conditioning, some behavior therapy elements, cognitive therapy elements, and exposure therapy elements. All of these kind of come together in EFT in a nice little recipe. So we're gonna break that down later, right? Willem Einthoven in 1924 discovered the electromagnetic field of the heart, and the Institute of Heart Math in the 90s discovered that your physical heart has little clusters of ganglia cells in the wall of the heart that they label as little brains. And this is really interesting stuff, just pointing to the fact that your heart not only receives information from the brain, including from the vagus nerve and all the information of the emotions that you're feeling, but the heart also seems to generate some of its own information and sends it up to the brain. So that's really important just in terms of EFT, bringing a calming effect to that messaging highway. Then we get looking at, so the next slide, Dr. Roger Callahan. He combined tapping on acupoints with exposure. He had studied applied kinesiology, and so he developed what he called initially Callahan techniques, later changed the name to thought field therapy, or TFT, right? And so, and then we have Fred Gallo in around the year 2000, coining the term energy psychology. So there's other energy psychology methodologies out there, including Reiki and others. So EFT is just probably one of the more prolifically used at this point in time. Right, so Roger Callahan had a lady by the name of Mary. So the next slide talks about Mary. And so she's kind of touted as sort of the first real benefactor. And so Dr. Callahan was a psychologist in California. He tried all the typical things. If you look on the right side there of the slide, systematic desensitization, all these things. Mary had a lifelong phobia, intense phobia of water, which is really strange, right? She had frequent headaches, terrifying nightmares. She could hardly bathe, had never been to the beach. That's a terrible thing when you live on the coast in California, right? In thought field therapy, you diagnose where the energy system disruptions are, and then you would use one of his tapping algorithms, tapping on different acupressure points in a certain order. So that's really a hallmark of TFT. And it really requires, again, that only a trained clinician can help you with TFT, right? But what he discovered, if we go to the next slide with Mary, so he asked her where she felt the fear in her body. When she said, in my stomach, he already knew from his studies that one of the energy meridians in the body runs from your big toe up through your stomach to the top of the head and then down right below and ends right below the eyes. He therefore asked her while she was focusing on the feeling in her stomach to tap gently on the meridian endpoints below her eyes. When she did, she looked up and said, it's gone. Mary drove to the beach, splashed in the water, and then he followed her really for years, and she remained phobia free. So next slide, Gary Craig, one of his students, had the brilliant idea. What if you just tap? In other words, what if you eliminate the diagnosing and the algorithms and just tap on a certain number of points, 12 to 14 points, really in any order, as long as you're kind of hitting the major energy meridian endpoints, you're probably going to get it right. And so in collaboration with Adrienne Fowley, he published an online manual, which is actually one of your handouts. I believe it's called the EFT manual. It's dated like 2007 or something like that, so that you can look through that. It's kind of an interesting read, just to go back to kind of the, and that had been around for a little while. So if you want to read that, I think it's going to be helpful to you today. So Gary Craig has since retired. And so the same configuration of EFT, kind of the methodology of EFT, became available as a free online download in the form of the EFT mini manual through EFT Universe. And so EFT Universe is really one of the better, if not the prominent place for you to go to really look into getting, if you want to get certification. There are other places to do that. ACEP is one of them, ACEP. But EFT Universe is definitely a primary source for you. If you go to that website and just even go to the very bottom of the page, you'll see a bunch of topics on using EFT with different conditions and even like physical, medical conditions and things like that. All right. So the next slide is kind of what I just shared with you. Probably one of the best places to go is EFT Universe. In the time leading up to Gary Craig's retirement, he did publish a book called The Unseen Therapist. I've not read it. He kind of talks about leaving tapping behind and tapping into sort of this higher power type being, I guess you might say. So I just want to let you know about that. You can kind of form your own opinion. I'm not going to predispose you to think of it one way or the other, but my concern as a clinician is it does feel like it gets into more of a mystical guru status type of thing. Kind of leaves behind maybe some of the more hands-on, sorry, forgive the pun, use of the tapping itself, which I think we have to keep people grounded in what works and why it works versus maybe more of the spiritual side where you're kind of tapping into something unseen. So again, I just want to make you aware of kind of the direction that he went. But that being said, if you go to the website that he put up, which you can still do, which is emofree.com, there are a lot of free tutorials. Basically, those tutorials will walk you through all the basics as well. And then each section has a place where you can click on advanced material, and I think there's a little bit of a fee to access those, but I don't think it's anything exorbitant. Pretty reasonable. So that is online as well. Okay. Dawson Church is the one who heads up EFT Universe. He's an author and researcher. He wrote a book called The Genie in Your Genes. He admonishes people to remain humble. I mean, it's an important message because as you become effective with a tool like EFT, it's easy to get a little bit of an inflated ego and kind of set yourself up to be that guru. But we have to be careful. There's so much left to learn. And so what he says here at the bottom of this slide says, for the first time in history, the consciousness of a species is interacting with the process of evolution, meaning that people are learning to use enhanced consciousness as an epigenetic intervention to change gene expression. And so I don't personally actually believe in evolution, but I do believe that what we're learning is that some of these interventions like EFT are helping people on such a physiological basis that it's freeing up some of the things that maybe had been problematic for them on an epigenetic basis. So there's a lot of research being done on this now. And it obviously, anything that we do to relieve people of the trauma capsule associated with their memories is going to facilitate physical, emotional, mental, spiritual health, right? So that's really what he's speaking to there. The next slide, EFT in the context of where things are going. I'm going to skip over that. Again, there's some slides in here that are things that you can come back to. But I do want to say that there may be some folks in my audience today who are Christians as practitioners who have a Christian basis. And I just want to say to you that EFT, people can use it in any way that they want. And so whatever your belief system is, you can make EFT fit with your belief system. If you do hold a more of a new age type of belief system, EFT is going to fit right in with that. If you're a Christian, I would say to you, my personal opinion is it's okay, because EFT at its core is a tapping based intervention on the body that also involves the person tuning in mentally to what the problem is, right? So there's nothing unbiblical about that. I just want to share that with you. And there's a book title coming up that you'll also appreciate. The next slide says diagnosis of energy system disruptions needed, ? Again, the good news is that with EFT, you can kind of skip the diagnosing part in terms of trying to figure out which order to tap in. So that's one of the great things about EFT, right? So Gary Craig said, the fact is one who masters EFT can do everything that TFT does while covering a far wider variety of problems without having to use muscle testing. So muscle testing is something that some EFT practitioners use heavily and others not necessarily so much, because the client is still going to be able to tell you what their subjective unit of distress is when you're trying to bring the number down from 10 to 0. I think everyone probably knows what a SUD is, right? So where's your depression today? 10 is, the most severe depression you've ever felt. 0, not present at all. They might say I'm at about a 6.5 today. Muscle testing is something that comes from applied kinesiology, and it's used pretty extensively with a lot of EFT practitioners. An example was listed here, making sure that if you utilize this with someone, that they don't have any arm or shoulder injuries or anything like that where you could hurt them. But for the average person, you would ask them to focus on the problem that you're working on. And the example here is more general. The person might say, I know I can lose all the weight I want to lose, right? This is their goal. They want to lose weight. They believe they can. This is what they're verbalizing, right? So you ask them to hold one of their arms straight out in front of them and make a fist, hold their arm out. And you're going to ask them to simply resist. You're pushing down on basically push down on their wrist. You're asking them not to push up against your pressure that you're applying. But you're just asking them to resist. With EFT and with energy psychology, there's something called psychological reversal. We're going to talk about that in a minute. If psychological reversal is present, their arm will go weak, even though they have repeatedly stated the thing that they want to do, which is, I want to lose weight. I believe I can lose weight. This method, again, comes from applied kinesiology. So, you could have them think of a negative memory and then push down on their arm. Their arm is more than likely going to be very easy to push down because they're focused on a memory or a part of a memory that has some negative emotional charge to it. But then if you say, all right, take a deep breath, clear your mind, now focus on the most positive memory of your whole life and really feel it and really tune into it. When you push down on their arm, it's going to be like trying to push a brick wall. And so the body, it's just like vessel ventricle, the body keeps score. Well, when people say they want to lose weight and then you push down on their arm and their arm tests weak, we know that psychological reversal is present. Mentally they believe that they can lose weight, but in their body they don't believe it. Okay, so that's what EFT addresses. We're going to go on to the next slide. Evidence-based practice. So if you, again, I'm going to show you some book titles here in a minute. If you purchase the EFT manual, which you can get online through Amazon or through EFT Universe, you're going to find some good information in there about the evidence-based foundation that now underlies EFT. So I'll let you do that on your own. Here's some of the book titles I mentioned. You have the EFT manual by Dawson Church. So that's a great place to start in addition to this manual that you're getting today. You can see there's been some other titles, EFT for PTSD. That was written by Gary Craig. That may still be available in terms of his authorship. I believe Dawson Church has his own kind of updated version of it. You can see other titles, the EFT for the highly sensitive temperament, EFT for weight loss, EFT for Christians by Sherry Rice Smith. And so there's a bunch of others. I just kind of put these here. The two at the bottom right of your screen, the Clinical EFT Handbook, Volume 1 and Volume 2. I have those here with me. I just want to read since it's so small on your screen. Volume 1 covers biomedical and physics principles, psychological trauma, and then just the fundamental techniques of clinical EFT. So that if you're going to pick one, just get Volume 1 and start there. These run in the $45 range. They're hardback books, fantastic to have and read. The Clinical Handbook Volume 2 covers integrative medical settings, special populations, sports and business performance, and then innovations in EFT. So those are excellent resources for you. All right. The next slide, this goes back to the beginnings of EFT with Gary Craig. The discovery statement, which was the cause of all negative emotions, is a disruption in the body's energy system. Well, that's pretty profound. We could stop right there and talk about that all day long. If that's true, that would explain a lot about why some of the talk therapy that's been done for decades doesn't really bring much relief. People learn how to cope, and we equip them with coping skills. We get them connected with a caring community. But in terms of the trauma itself, a lot of talk therapy doesn't bring much relief. And it could be because of this, right? Dawson Church, in the meantime, now in probably about 2018 or so, he says, these magical explanations seem quaint today, 20 years later. Now that we know the role of genetics, stress hormones, early childhood experiences, behavioral conditioning, and neural signaling in the experience of negative emotions. So it's not magical. It is true that the body's energy system is intimately involved with trauma, but we now know more than we did. So again, the EFT manual will give you some more scientific and research information to help you get a better bird's eye view of what of kind of how all that works together with the body's energy system. The next slide, it's all connected. I'm going to skip that one. This is stuff you already know. But one of the examples there, just the fourth bullet point, we already know a melody or an aroma can activate long forgotten memories. So we just know that all these things are interconnected. The next slide, what can EFT be used to address? The short answer really is just about everything. When we think about addressing physical symptoms, cognitive and emotional symptoms. So you can see that list there. The writing on my walls is the fifth bullet there. So these are all the hidden beliefs that we carry around in our subconscious, right? So EFT begins to bring those things to light and address them, right? We even get down to the second to last bullet point where it says disease specific. So it takes a little bit of mastery with EFT to get to that place, to kind of know better what you're doing with something that's really more about physical diseases. So I'm going to let you do your own reading on that. There's a little bit in this manual on that, but not much. All right. Again, the bottom of EFTuniverse.com has these different topics, as you can see. You could spend 6 weeks just reading all this stuff, right? Which is good. Next slide, what can EFT be used to address? So, negative beliefs, especially in cliche form, represent smoke from the fires of our deeper wounds and losses. But then they become problems in and of themselves. Both the smoke and the fire can be addressed with EFT. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. All the good ones are taken. All these beliefs that just become almost like inner vows. Like these are things we tell ourselves are true and we feel that they're true, but they're rooted in experiences, and it's those experiences that EFT will address. So thank you for your patience. We're going to get to how to do EFT here in a few minutes. Right? Again, there's an entire chapter in the manual. Next slide, how EFT works, called The Science Behind EFT. So let me just spend a moment here. Neutralizing and balancing out disruptions in specific energy meridians associated with negative thoughts, beliefs, feelings, and perceptions. Unblocking blocked or reversed energy meridians. So it's the metaphor that has been used is like putting a battery into a flashlight backwards. And so your energy system around specific issues like trauma-related thoughts and feelings, it's almost like your energy system got reversed, and the energy isn't flowing properly. It's really been blocked. It's been compromised, and so EFT helps to get things back into balance. Cognitive shifts. EFT produces thoughts of being at peace, feeling safe, moving on, etc. And so it doesn't take the memories away, but what it does is it neutralizes the negative emotional charge, and the memory now becomes factual information rather than something that continues to drive people emotionally in directions that they don't want to go. So this last paragraph from the EFT manual, psychologists used to think that strongly encoded memories were permanent, that learnings formed in the presence of strong emotion could not be changed. However, recent research in memory reconsolidation shows that there is a brief period of time, about 4 hours in duration, just after an emotionally encoded early memory has been reawakened, when its emotional content can be untagged. The neurological wiring governing our old response can be rewired during this window of time. EFT takes advantage of this window. So when a trauma memory is brought up, there's a period of time where it can be untagged through the use of what EFT calls the basic recipe. We're going to look at that. The next slide. 3 conditions necessary for memory reconsolidation. We need vivid re-exposure to the memory or the experience. At the same time, a positive contradictory memory or experience must be activated. In talk therapy, we find that when you try to bring up some of the positives in a person's life while they're thinking about and talking about a painful memory, which thing takes precedence, right? Which thing is more powerful? Well, we know it's the negative stuff that tends to get people to think things like, well, they didn't really love me, or, so the positive really doesn't stand much of a chance when the negative is so strong and so powerful, right? And then so several repetitions of this juxtaposition may be necessary. That's what EFT does. You go through several rounds of tapping using the basic recipe of what we're going to look at here in a minute, right? So next slide. How it works a little bit more. I'm going to skip over this just so that, again, you can come back to this on your own. Okay, so the setup statement is part of the where you start with EFT. All right, so the setup statement has us face and remember a negative emotional experience. This represents the exposure therapy part of EFT. We then see a form of cognitive therapy at work when, within the setup statement, the person then pairs the remembered trauma with a new cognitive input or a cognitive reframing of the memory by using a statement of self-acceptance. So we're going to look at that. While the person keeps the problem conscious, EFT then has us tap on our bodies in a non-traumatic manner. Gentle tapping also interrupts the emotional triggering that we've created through the traumatic memory, i.e. pairing of a troublesome memory with a soothing physical stimulus often breaks the power of that memory, reducing its emotional intensity. After tapping, the body no longer associates the memory with stress, showing that the conditioned feedback loop has been broken and healed. All right. How EFT works, next slide. So how it works, I'm going to skip over this. Again, it's a little bit more background stuff.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
Just super quick, we did have a question come into the chat box.
Okay.
The question is this tapping done with an acupuncture needle or by finger? What pressure is used, done by a clinician or client to themselves?
Right. It's used with your fingers. If you're not licensed to touch people, right, like a massage therapist would be or a physical therapist, you're not going to tap on people. Or at least ethically speaking, you probably shouldn't. But you could, if a client is present, they have a family member present, sometimes having someone else tap for you on your acupressure points in appropriate ways, that helps the person to actually mentally tune in to the memory that you're working on or the aspect that you're working on. It kind of removes the tapping from their menu of things that they have to do, but most people can tap while remaining focused, and we'll explain that here in a minute as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes. The next slide just gives you some thoughts about the energy meridians and kind of what they're associated with in the body and specific organ systems. You don't have to know this stuff to do EFT, but it's just kind of nice to have it there. And that's why Dr. Callahan was able to say, oh, let's tap on the meridian point under the eye, because he knew that meridian point traveled through the stomach, and that's where she was feeling her disruption, right? So then he was able to figure that out. Next slide also gives you a little bit more information about the connection between the energy meridians in the body and physical conditions that we may see. This lady has some pigmentation, things that reflect some aspects of her body's energy system. So I really can't explain all that to you. If you go to a reflexologist, there's points on the ear, bottom of the feet, and the hands. A reflexologist is someone who's going to be able to explain all that and also do some similar kinds of treatment to EFT. Okay. Next slide. Can EFT be harmful? Unlike EMDR, it does not stir up the emotional content, which is great. So there really aren't, negative side effects per se with EFT. At worst, it might produce no effect for a particular person at a particular time. The negatives associated with EFT are just like any other therapy. Just the fact that you're tackling sensitive problems with people, yes. I mean, even when EFT is effective, we're still trained to help mitigate some, people's reactions to having change in their life and those kinds of things. It can change even the nature of relationships that people are in. That could be considered a negative result, right? EFT working, right? So, but that's true of any therapy that's being effective. The bottom bullet here says the primary danger, so to speak, is when people become overly confident, begin using it to address issues they're not qualified or skilled enough to address, or they use it as a panacea when other interventions are still needed and appropriate. Okay. Next slide. This is more about the client. Okay. So again, can EFT be harmful? Dawson Church writes about a lady at a 4-day workshop who seemed to be helped, but then her SUDS kept going back up. He concluded that she did not have a strong enough set of positive beliefs and experiences in her mind to support her healing. So even though EFT helped, and it helped pretty powerfully, it was temporary. So this lady, was able to explain that she had been weepy and overwhelmed most of her life. So while EFT could help delete some negative emotion, there wasn't any positive emotion available to emerge at the end of the process. This lady ended up benefiting from simply working with a psychotherapist without EFT for a period of time. And getting someone like this who has zero resources to draw from, internal resources in terms of positive memories, positive relationships. I mean, there are people who, when you have someone walk through your door who's like that, it because there's just everything is negative. Nothing has ever been good or healthy or peaceful or anything. So they should not start with EFT. You want to get them connected with, a healing community. It could be a DBT group. It could be a recovery group. Get them in a place where they can start experiencing and internalizing some of those kinds of relationship-based resources. Then EFT can start to be more effective with that person. So that would be probably the main thing to keep in mind. 90% probably of your clients, 95% can benefit from EFT, maybe even higher percentage. Okay, so the next slide, informed consent. I believe one of your handouts, let me check here. Yeah, one of your handouts, it says EHP, informed consent form. That's an example that I put together. It's very lengthy, but it gives you lots of things to think about when you're trying to figure out for yourself everything that you want to include in your informed consent with a client. Okay, so I apologize in advance. It's a lot of material there, but I think it'll help you sift through it and kind of figure out, okay, this is what I need to include. All right. So the next slide, ethics and informed. Here's a great ethics handbook for energy healing practitioners. Okay. So some other resources here. ASAP is included there. EFT uses the metaphor of the tabletop. So the next slide says the tabletop, table legs, and forest metaphors. And the idea is that the tabletop may be someone has just generalized fear and anxiety. But we all know that there are specific experiences that now hold that tabletop up. So EFT is going to address the underlying traumas and negative experiences that keep that anxiety active in a person's life today, right? We know that the brain works by association. And so one of the great things with EFT is that once you start neutralizing the negative emotions associated with 2 or 3 or 4 major table legs, which are like significant trauma memories, there may be 500 other table legs, but when you address the big ones up front, you'll find that the others kind of get neutralized as well, and that you're going to see a tremendous relief without having to tap on 500 memories, so to speak, right? So you can talk about the fear and anxiety all day long. You can talk about coping skills all day long, but until you neutralize what's underneath it, that person is probably going to remain somewhat frustrated. Next slide, a little bit more about the same kind of metaphor, the forest and the trees. Generally, we try to find the most intense memory. People aren't always able to go there initially, but the idea is that we try to get the big ones out of the way first rather than later. And that's a little bit different than the training that a lot of us have had in our careers. You know, we're trained to kind of work our way up to the bigger issues. With EFT, you can often tackle the big things up front, especially when a client is motivated and they're ready, willing, and able to go there. You can also use EFT to help people get ready to go there. So that's part of what's called the gentle techniques, which are described later in this manual. It's part of EFT, right? At the same time, you can start with some easier things. There's nothing wrong with that. You may get their SUDS down to a 2 or 3 on a less traumatic memory. And maybe it's stuck at a 2 or 3, and that tells you, you know what, we probably have some other bigger trauma memories and trauma capsules to work on. Once we do that, then we come back to this memory, and guess what? It's down to a 0. It has kind of magically disappeared in terms of the intensity, right? So you can go either way. Start with something smaller, so to speak, or you can, if someone's ready to dive into some of the problems, they can do that. Next slide, I'll let you read that on your own, just a little bit more about neurological processing. Psychological reversal. So this slide, again, has the phrase at the top. So, so we call it PR, and it's the cause of all self-sabotage. This is what we see in a lot of abuse survivors and people struggling with addictions, okay? So it says your energy system is subject to a form of electrical interference, which can block the balancing effect of these tapping procedures. In order for the tapping to be effective, in other words, in order for the basic recipe that we're going to look at to be effective, something called the setup is used to temporarily neutralize psychological reversal so that the tapping will work, right? So the principal cause of PR is negative thinking. This comes from trauma, obviously. All right, next slide. Okay. Generally, let me skip this because I'm going to just share it with you when we look at the basic recipe here in a minute. Okay, next slide. Again, just some thoughts about tapping and using the arm testing technique that we talked about. So you can kind of find out if they have some psychological reversal going on around a particular issue. So you would have them, you could use that with them if you'd like. Okay. The next slide. Okay, and this is a little bit more about being careful with, again, that small percentage of clients. But again, one of the great things is you don't have to believe in EFT for it to work. Okay, it doesn't have to be something that you feel is going to work for you. It'll work because you're doing it right. You're using the basic recipe properly. EFT cannot help with these specific things: suppressed or forgotten memories. I mean, it has to be a conscious memory, or at least on some level has to be conscious, so that the person can tune into it mentally while you're doing the tapping. With birth trauma, trauma in the womb, anything like that. But it will help with symptoms of, things that have played out in that person's life because of those problems. Some problems are intractable and are simply part of the human condition. Problems that are purely physical and which have no emotional content. So something like ringing in the ears probably has zero connection with a trauma memory in terms of the emotional side. It's usually just a physical condition. Okay. Next slide. Nevertheless, do use EFT to tap through all the person's negative thoughts and feelings about having a certain condition. And then you can use EFT to also install positive beliefs once you've cleared the forest of some of the major trees that have been getting in the way. Okay. All right, here we are. I know that took a while, but I think that was important to share all of that with you. Are you ready? Okay, so this image of this little girl, every time I look at it, fills me with joy. I don't know. Her face is just awesome. All right, so she's excited. Here we go. All right, so how to do the basic recipe. So I'm going to introduce you to the tapping points first. The first tapping point is the top of the head at the very top of your cranium. It's the spot where a string would be attached if someone were pulling you up straight up by the top of your head. When you tap, you're going to use, 2 or 3 fingers. It doesn't matter which hand you use. And the tapping is gentle. You're not pounding on your body. It's gentle tapping with just enough force to stimulate the acupressure point, but you don't have to tap hard at all. So again, you'll tap firmly, but not with great force. Okay, you can see there's an eyebrow point at the inner point of each eyebrow, the very outside of the eye, which is the edge of the bone, the very edge of the bone that's there. Under the eye, it's going to be right, kind of like if you have bags under your eyes, it's kind of at the right at the bottom of the bag under your eye, right? So if you can see, it's pretty close to the eye, though. You don't want to go too low. You have one right under the nose. You have one kind of in the crease of your chin. Okay. You also have the collarbone point, which is where your collarbone meets your sternum. And if you kind of find that little corner where those two things meet, where the flesh is, there's still a lot of bone there, but it's not the sternum and it's not the collarbone. It's right in that corner. Okay. You also have a place called the tender spot, which is at the top of the pectoral muscle. And this is used in the setup phrase, which we're going to look at in a minute. All right. That spot is actually a lymph node area of your body on both sides. If you rub it right now, it's probably sore because it's got some toxins that it's been filtering out of your body, out of your bloodstream. So that makes it kind of sore. It's called the tender spot. There's a spot under the arms, which is kind of where the what's the muscle in the back, where it kind of joins into your ribs. It's really, for women, it's where the bra strap is, usually located right there. It's also a little bit of a tender spot. It's right across from the nipple for men. And then there's also beneath the nipple point, which is where the muscle meets the breast. A lot of people skip that, especially with it when they're in an office setting or whatever, but you can use it on your own at home. It is a valid tapping point. And then you have tapping points on the hand, which you can see this is someone's right hand, the outside of the right thumb nail bed, or I should say the inside, really, towards your body. Inside of the pointer finger nail bed, middle finger, you skip the ring finger, and there's one at the pinky finger. The gamut point is used in the basic recipe. It's that crease in between the two bones, the tarsal bones of your pinky and your ring finger. So you can find that little valley in between the two bones of both that lead up to both of those fingers. Kind of a little groove down in there. That's it's called the gamut point. It's a tapping point. And then the karate chop point is literally just the very middle of the edge of your hand that you would use to karate chop a board with, right in the middle of the flesh there. Okay, so those are the tapping points that are used in EFT. There are other ones. And so one of the ones I like, so you have tapping points that literally run all the way down your midline from the base of your neck all the way down to your belly button. I like to tap on that midline, like actually on my belly, which is getting bigger. So, that everyone's going to have different experiences with which tapping points, quote unquote, feel better to them in terms of bringing relief when you're tapping on them with the basic recipe. All right, the next slide is the first thing that you do with the basic recipe is you help the person identify the specific problem they want to work on. It could be a physical, this sharp stabbing headache in both of my temples. That time my best friend's dog suddenly growled and bit me on the calf. The time my third grade teacher asked in front of the whole class if my bedwetting problem was getting any better, right? These are very specific things. EFT works best when you can be specific. You may ask them where they feel something in their body, just like with Mary, she felt her phobia in her stomach. Obviously, fill in the blank, my phobia of spiders or heights or whatever. Memories of my parents fighting all the time. That's not very specific, but it's a doorway to getting specific, right? When you have memories that represent a cluster of memories like that, you want to focus on the most distressing and earliest memories first as much as possible, right? Because what'll happen is if you can clear that one out, all the memories that came after that were built on that had that same negative emotional charge, those are going to get cleared out too. Okay. So once they identify the specific problem, it could be physical, cognitive, or emotional. Excuse me. You want to have them identify their units of distress, 0 to 10, 10 being equal to the most intense pain that they can ever imagine experiencing for this particular problem, or that they have ever experienced. And then 0 is there's no emotional disruption associated with that issue anymore. Okay, so that's the second thing. Identify the problem, have them rate it. Generally, you want to write down their rating for this particular problem. One of your handouts, maybe even two of your handouts, is a sheet where you can write down specific aspects that you're working on, specific problems. It could be one trauma memory with 10 key aspects that you've identified, and you're going to have them work on one at a time, and they're going to have a SUDS for each one of those. Okay. Next slide.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, really quickly, we have 2 questions in the chat box. Do you want me to hold them to the end or go ahead and send them?
Do you think they're key for us right now?
Well, they are questions specific to the tapping component. So one question is, what is the rate and duration to work on a tapping point? And the second question is, do you tap in that order top down?
So usually it's just for about 5, 6, 7 seconds that you're going to tap on each point as you go through the tapping points. So we're going to talk about that here in a moment. And you do not have to tap in any order. The points that you saw are the 14 or so points that are kind of the standard EFT tapping points. Like I said, you can add others. You can go online and learn a lot about other tapping points, where they are. There's nothing wrong with it. The point of keeping it to about 14 is you are also trying to be effective in a shorter period of time. And these 14 cover a lot of ground. So when you're tapping under the eye, you're hitting a lot of energy meridians that run through your torso. Same with the top of the head. Okay, so doing a round of tapping, which is what this is in terms of the basic recipe, you're trying to keep it as short as possible, but you're also doing enough to make sure that you're tapping on enough of the energy points. Okay. So again, you'll see this here in a minute as well. Step 3 is the first time that you're going to have the person say something. So this is where they're going to say out loud, even though I have this anxiety about being in elevators, even though I have this, they could phrase it, even though I have this elevator anxiety problem, I deeply and completely love, accept, and forgive myself. I added the word forgive just from some of the reading that I've done. Gary Craig originally just had, I completely love and accept myself. I added the word forgive because I've seen other people add it because it's such a meaningful word. But this is the setup statement. This is what begins to neutralize any psychological reversal that might be present around this particular problem. Okay, so they're going to repeat this 3 times while tapping on the karate chop point, which I showed you on the side of the hand. So they're going to be tapping that point while saying this out loud 3 times. Or they could rub the tender spot. You can use the karate chop point or the tender spot. You know what? People have their preferences. Both are effective. Both are valid. All right. So they're going to say this 3 times while tapping or rubbing that spot. Okay. Now, just jumping ahead a little bit, it says it's okay to change the wording from the first to the second and from the second to the third time repeating the setup, as long as the first part of the setup describes the specific problem and as long as the second part represents some kind of positive self-affirmation. So somebody could be tapping and say, even though I have this problem about getting onto elevators, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. Second time they say it, they might say, even though I feel like I'm freaking out every time I get into an elevator, I deeply and completely love, accept, and forgive myself. And the third time they say it, they might say, even though I feel like I'm going to die every time I get into an elevator, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. As long as you're zeroing in on that specific problem, it's okay if they change the wording a little bit with that first part, as described just now, right? Excuse me. Using the setup statement is necessary about 60% of the time. Excuse me. I'm going to take a drink here real quick. Oh my goodness, you have that little tickle in your throat, right? You ever get that? A lot of people use the setup every time because they're just going to cover all their bases. When we think about Mary with the phobia of water, it's actually kind of amazing. And I don't think Dr. Callahan knew about the setup phrase aspect of how to do things, with tapping. I don't think he had developed it yet. When she tapped on that endpoint under her eye, there is a good chance that psychological reversal would have caused that to not work because her energy system had been so disrupted for so long and she had so much fear and so much negative thoughts and emotions around it. The chances were good that psychological reversal was going to just stop EFT in its tracks. Miraculously, it worked that day. So you know what? There's nothing wrong with leaving the setup statement out. Okay, I'm sharing it with you right now so you know what it is. It should be used pretty frequently. But if you leave it out and going on to step 4 works, great, right? So this is another way to shorten EFT for some people for some problems, okay? So, but typically you're going to need to include it if the person has had chronic depression, any kind of ongoing addictions, trauma, they're engaged in something pretty significant like self-harm, eating disorder. So a lot of times you're going to need it. The next slide is step 3A. Okay, so the setup statement just described is what you will use in addressing a significant number of problems. Okay. However, you will need to get more specific with your use of the setup statement when no progress is being made and when you know that someone is likely to be coming to you weighed down with a massive amount of negative thoughts and feelings. Okay. You'll jump ahead to slides 79 through 83 to learn about how to use the setup even more effectively when addressing basically what we call secondary benefit syndrome, which is like when people want to remain sick, when they want to remain in their problem. So the setup is going to address it. But some people use the setup too briefly. They need to spend more time with using the setup to address specific things that have to do with, you know, the secondary gain that people get from not being well. But an example would be tapping on the karate chop point while saying, even though I don't deserve to get better, I still love myself enough to be here and begin working on my healing. So that's a sample of how to begin to use the setup to address the fact that they don't feel like they can get better. There's lots of ways to tweak that. Okay. The next slide. Now this is where, okay, you've used the setup phrase 3 times. Now you're ready to address the actual problem through tapping, right? So you're going to tap about 7 times on each of the following energy points while repeating the reminder phrase at each point. The reminder phrase would be my fear of elevators, feeling like I'm going to die when I get on elevators. Okay. So again, you're going to tap through these points. Okay. Again, there's no tapping point on the ring finger. Next slide. Right, so this is just, again, this is the reminder phrase. So now they're tapping the point at the top of their head while saying the reminder phrase. The reminder phrase keeps them tuned in to the problem that you're trying to address, right? At each tapping point, it causes them to stay mentally and emotionally focused and tuned in. They could just say, this headache, this sharp headache in my temples, anger towards my father, this war memory, this stiffness in my neck, these nightmares, this craving for caffeine, this depression, this sadness, right? Now, what's great is if you can get a little more creative with that, a little more specific with the reminder phrase. You know, this knife blade in my temple headache, this I was always ignored by my father, anger, this nauseating fear of attack at the crossroads, war memory, this stupid car accident, neck stiffness, this getting mugged nightmare. You know, so, you know, helping people to get more specific is ideal. The more specific, the better. Okay. So again, they're saying this reminder phrase out loud while tapping on the points. Okay. The next slide shows you. Okay, so the last slide we think of as kind of the slice of bread, the top slice of bread in a sandwich. The 9-gamut procedure is like kind of in the middle of the bread, to be followed up by the same thing that we just did. Okay. Now, the 9-gamut procedure can often be left out. But if you're using the rest of the basic recipe, including the setup, and things just don't seem to be getting better, their suds is not coming down, add the gamut procedure back in, the 9-gamut procedure back in. And all it is the person is doing these things while tapping the gamut point on the hand. Eyes closed, eyes open, eyes hard down to the right, down to the left, rolling their eyes. So I know these things sound weird, but these all have to do with sort of getting the energy system unstuck, okay? A lot of people like to use the 9-gamut procedure all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. If you can leave it out and you're being effective, great, okay? Next slide. You're just going to do the sequence again, which is the slide before the 9-gamut slide that we just looked at. You're going to go back through the 14 tapping points while repeating the reminder phrase. Okay. Now you're just going to check in with them. That's 1 round of tapping. If the negative problem or symptom or emotion is still rated higher than 0 after 1 round, that's okay. Maybe it was at an 8, came down to a 5. You're going to go back through the basic recipe again, focusing on the same specific problem. You're going to use the setup or not, depending on if the first round was effective or not. This time, you're going to tweak the setup phrase a little bit. You're just going to say, even though I still have some of this fear of elevators, I deeply and completely love, accept, forgive myself. And then while they're tapping on the 14 points, they're just going to say this remaining fear of elevators. It's just a little verbal tweak. All right. basically you're just going to do as many rounds. Shouldn't take more than 3 or 4 rounds. I mean, if the number isn't coming down at all, there may be some other things going on, but it should come down close to 0 or down to a 0. If it never comes down to a 0, there are maybe some other unidentified aspects of this problem. Could be that there's a memory underlying their fear of elevators, and now you're going to target that memory, break it down into its upsetting aspects, mental, emotional, cognitive, physical, and you're going to tap through those. And then when you come back to their fear of elevators today, it should be down to a 0 if you really address the core memories. Okay. You can see that this takes some time, but boy, it's a lot faster than 3 or 4 years of talk therapy, right? So again, that's the great thing with EFT. Okay.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
We have one question related to the actual tapping method. They would like to know, do you do multiple rounds in a single session?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You're gonna do rounds on, the great thing is you can, and you may have to take some notes, right, while you're talking with someone, where anytime a negative thought or emotion comes up, that that's something that you can target with EFT. Okay. So it is easy to get overwhelmed. It's easy to kind of feel swamped with all these things, which is why you want to target those table legs and those big trees in the forest and really go after those as soon as possible and stay focused on them. So one of the slides coming up is called the movie technique. And it's basically looking at, kind of giving a memory like a movie title, and then breaking that movie down into its frames, right? Like movie frames. And Gary Craig, I remember watching a video one time where he went to a VA hospital, and he was given a few days to work with veterans using EFT. And I remember just watching him working with a Vietnam veteran who, he had a memory that came up all the time in his nightmares, and during the day, of course, he would think about it. So they targeted that key memory. This is one of the big trees in the forest. And he used the movie technique. And every time they got to a frame of the movie, so to speak, in terms of how that memory played out, they would stop and tap on that aspect of the memory. And I think it all just started, they walked into a village and a child was walking towards them. And of course, in Vietnam, some children were soldiers. So that was the first spike in emotion associated with the memory, right? So they tapped on that aspect of, the child is walking towards our troop. Then they got to the next aspect and the next aspect, and they worked through the whole memory that way. Came back and did it again. The third time, when he had the gentleman replay the memory out loud, he literally yawned because what EFT had done was it took the memory, neutralized the negative charges in it. Now the memory no longer had the negative charge. So now the man could tell the story like, okay, I'm tired of talking about this memory now. I'm kind of bored with it now, right? So again, that's one of the most beautiful things about EFT, is it neutralizes those aspects of a memory so that the whole memory just becomes a fact. It's just part of their story, but it's no longer debilitating, right? So if you can't get the SUDS down to a 0, sometimes you can use the floor to ceiling eye roll. That's described later in the manual. It's just a quick little thing that you can do. You have them take a deep breath, maybe take a sip of water. By the way, you want people to be pretty hydrated. Have all of your electronics away from both of you. Preferably have your electronics off. You don't want disruptions from electronics in the room. And then write down any new aspects or issues that arose. Have them re-rate the original issue using the SUDS. Okay. And you just keep going after it until you get it down to a 0. If it can't come down to a 0, you try to find out, all right, what are we missing? There's probably some other aspect that we're missing of this particular memory, or a related memory, or something like that. Okay. I know we're getting close to time here, so I'm glad we can at least get through the basic recipe with you today. Like I said, this is an introduction. I think once we get through this here in a moment, you'll be able to read the rest of the manual and understand what I'm saying, okay? Which is great because you're going to be able to start, implementing and you have to know the basic recipe. Even children can use it. So, it's not going to, you're not going to get farther in the manual and say, no, wait, what is he talking about? It's going to be, this is the foundation of everything that comes later. There's ways to shorten it. The basic recipe, there's 2 ways to do that here. You can see aspects of the basic recipe that you can skip. But again, you can always add them back in if you're not being successful. All right. The next slide is the floor to ceiling eye roll. You're just tapping the gamut point continuously. Take about 6 seconds. The person's going to move their eyes, keeping their head still. They're going to move their eyes from hard down all the way up while repeating the reminder phrase. It often just helps if the suds is down at a 1 or a 2 to get it down to a 0. All right. All right. So next slide, thoughts about tapping. There's some good information here. Just some general things. We've covered a couple of these already. Some tapping, does start with focusing in on a physical symptom. One lady had a pain in her neck, and they couldn't get it down to 0 in terms of just focusing on, tapping on this pain in my neck. It turned out she had a car accident when her sister was driving the car when the client was like 12 years old or something like that. And so they found the memory, and then they tapped on all the aspects of the memory. And one of those aspects was forgotten guilt. The client had dared her sister to do something while driving, and it resulted in the accident. Once that guilt came to light and they tapped on the feelings of guilt, the pain in her neck went away. So it's very powerful, and but you just have to get down to the very specific aspects that are driving the symptoms. Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions? We're at 10 till. This would be a good spot to pause and just take any other questions.
We did have one additional question come in. So the question is, if the client agrees, would this be accurate to use with a diagnosis of schizoaffective where the client is successfully medicated but has a fear of driving?
I would say yes, because you're basically, EFT addresses the human side of life. I mean, it's basically if you're human and you feel things, right? And some of those things are negative, those become fair game for EFT, right? It's not going to do anything to her other psychiatric condition. It's not going to worsen it. It's not going to, cause it to suddenly throw her medications off kilter or anything like that. What it may do, though, is create some emotional peace that allows the person to function better, which then may then inform their relationship with their doctor to figure out if they need certain medicines as much as they used to, right? So that's the beauty of it as well, is that it becomes part of the person's own self-care to be able to have those conversations when they are feeling better and when they are experiencing relief from things that aren't related to schizoaffective disorder, but are just part of being human, right? So great question, thank you. Anything else pop up in the chat?
So we've got some questions coming in. We have, can this be implemented via teletherapy?
Yes.
Perfect. And then if there's enough time, will you give a full example as if you were the elevator client starting from the setup statement while tapping?
Right. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So, let me say this. You're going to do all of your normal assessment process with a client. You're going to do all the diagnostic assessment process. You're going to do the treatment plan, all those things. When you're ready, when they express to you like, hey, I really have this fear of elevators, that, barring any other major concerns that we talked about, like if this person is a good candidate because they're in that 95% of people who can benefit from EFT, you're going to jump right in with tapping, right? So it's not complicated in that sense. In other words, you may start tapping, get their suds down to a 4. And by the way, when in between rounds of tapping, If you have them just tap on the karate chop point while talking with you about what they just experienced and what other things are coming up in their mind, it actually does help. It does seem to help the mind to release other, what we call splinters of the trees, right? Like other little aspects that might be missed if you were just talking about it. So tapping on that karate chop point while just talking about the issue can be very helpful in the process. Really what's going to happen is you're going to follow what comes up. So if they say, yeah, my fear of elevators, and you tap on that in general, it could be that all of their fear stems from the fact that when the elevator first moves, it lurches a little bit. Well, if you tap on that, even though I have this fear of lurching elevators, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. If you get that suds down to 0, you might find that their fear of elevators is gone. Okay. It could be that now another aspect comes up because after that first round, and let's say it gets down to a 0 in that first round, you're asking them, all right, what else are you noticing? They may say, gosh, it's also about being a little bit claustrophobic. Oh, okay, let's tap on that. Even though I feel a little bit claustrophobic when I'm inside an elevator, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. So they're tapping on that, using the reminder phrase, my elevator claustrophobia is going to be something like that is going to be the reminder phrase while they're tapping. So in other words, EFT kind of guides you even as you're using it. Okay. And you'll see that as you go through the manual on your own. It's really kind of just a fluid, organic process. You're not dictating to the person. What you are doing, though, sometimes is they may get enough relief from a particular issue that they're ready to move on to a completely different issue. But that their suds only got down to a 3 on that first issue. So you want to say, hold on a second, let's write that other thing down. We'll get to that. Let's go back and get this 3 down to a 0, right? Because it's easy for people to just start, jumping all over the map because they feel in that moment, they actually feel some relief. They're ready to move on to something else. You want to make sure you're kind of clearing out the forest in that area first, okay? So I know that's a little bit of a weird answer, but it is the nature of EFT to kind of guide you as you're using it. Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I haven't received any additional questions in the chat box. However, if I have accidentally overlooked a question, please let me know. And we have about 1 minute left. And Greg, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this presentation. I have learned a ton. I'm really excited to use it even personally. I think that this can be helpful and effective. So thank you so much. And we'll wait just another moment or two to see if any more questions come in.
Okay, great. You're welcome. And thank you. This has been great just to share the basics here today. We didn't get through the whole manual. I didn't think we could. There's so much, but yet it all comes back to the basic recipe. That's why I was a little bit concerned about Gary Craig's direction that he went in. So I just want to encourage you to, always keep the basic recipe at the center of your use of EFT.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And just logistically, folks, you should be seeing that breakout rooms will close in 47 seconds and we'll return to the main room. Please make sure you do return to the main room for lunch instructions. And we look forward to seeing you all this afternoon as well.
By the way, EFT is great with kids, especially kids who don't have all the emotional baggage that adults do. So I had a kid who threw up in class when he gave a little speech, and we targeted that one memory, and he was completely symptom-free after that.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. You can go ahead and click leave breakout room, or in 5 seconds, it will automatically take us all there. Thank you again, everyone.
Because it's November.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody I paused my recording. Somebody else's recording? I don't know. I just got a weird recording.